It was a murder trial that captivated the world. Amanda Knox, a 20-year-old American student who had been studying in Italy, accused of killing her British roommate Meredith Kercher. The year was 2007, and Kercher had been found brutally murdered in her home in Perugia, Italy. Investigators quickly set their sights on Amanda Knox, her Italian boyfriend Raffaele Sollecito, and Ivorian national Rudy Guede. Prosecutors alleged Kercher's death had been the result of a sadistic sex game gone wrong. The case received intense media attention, with Knox in particular becoming the focus of sensational coverage in Italy and worldwide. The media frequently portrayed her as promiscuous and unremorseful, her every gesture scrutinized, frequently confirming the prosecution's characterization of the events that led to Kercher's death. Knox and Sollecito were convicted of Kercher's murder in 2009, but were exonerated 2 years later on appeal. All in all, the two spent nearly 4 years in detention before being released. In a separate trial in 2008, Rudy Guede was convicted of sexually assaulting and killing Meredith Kercher. He served 13 years in prison for the murder. Italy's highest court definitively exonerated Knox and Sollecito in 2015, ending the years-long legal saga. Knox has since become an advocate for criminal justice reform, working to raise awareness about what is termed trial by media and the conditions that can lead to wrongful conviction. On this episode of The InnerView, I'll talk to Amanda Knox about the murder trial that upended her life and her efforts to see that others don't have the same experience. Thanks for joining us on The InnerView. Amanda Knox joins us now from Seattle. Amanda, welcome to the program. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you very much. Looking forward to chatting to you. Amanda, it's been an extraordinary story. Those horrendous events that happened in Perugia, Meredith Kercher, brutally murdered 17 years ago, 15 years since the first conviction, then an acquittal, then another conviction and an acquittal, and there was a lot happening back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. You're a free person. Why is it so important for you to continue to tell your story in your words, on your own terms?
Like many wrongfully convicted people, I had my story stolen from me before I was really a person. I went from being an anonymous college student to one of the most infamously hated women on the planet for something that I had nothing to do with. And my story was told over and over again in the international media for years from a very biased perspective. And I felt that adding my one voice to the experience and to that narrative was going to be really helpful, not just for me to regain a sense of sanity and agency in my own life, but also for setting the record straight and shedding light on how wrongful convictions happen and what the overall impact is for other people as well.
A lot of that bias and a lot of those insinuations and the character assassination came from what they expected you to be doing in the aftermath of the murder, how you were expected to behave. Had you known that that's a part of it, that the cameras are going to be on you and there's a certain formula for being an innocent person, how a supposedly innocent person behaves versus how a sketchy, possibly guilty person behaves, would you have behaved differently as a 20-year-old?
I think that with hindsight, looking back, if I were, of course, we can't actually go back in time and change things, right? So a part of me is always resistant to questions like that because at 20 years old, I had no idea what was going on. I was so overwhelmed. I had very little life experience, very little interactions with the police before. I had been raised to believe that they were my protectors and that I could trust them 100%. I was not aware of how, I was also in shock, and I didn't quite, the fact that of Meredith's murder was so surreal and so overwhelming that I think a part of me really just clammed up and clung to whoever I felt that I could trust in that moment, that being my boyfriend at the time and the police. If I could go back in time today, the thing that I would do is I would ask for help. I would reach out to my mom and demand that she come and help me, and I would ask for a lawyer.
Mm.
I had no idea as an innocent person that I would need help because I trusted the police, and that was my biggest mistake.
Something that was said during interrogation at that time in the immediate aftermath has still come back to haunt you in some way, the upholding of the conviction of slander or defamation because you named Patrick Lumumba, who was your boss at the bar. I mean, two parts to this question. Firstly, does it hurt that according to the law in Italy, you'll never fully be able to clear your name? And secondly, do you still feel, is there a sort of ugliness still attached to it that what was said during that interrogation has still lived on all these years later and continues to be a sort of blot on your name and your record?
Absolutely. I mean, I remain a wrongly convicted person 17 years later. I think that because I was acquitted, definitively exonerated of the most horrific charges of this crime, people think that I should be just grateful that
Mm.
I get to have my life back. And I push back on that and say, I remain a wrongly convicted person. What a definitive ruling here with the Italian courts does not represent what really happened. The what I'm fortunate to have right now is still an opportunity to appeal this conviction. So I am going to be appealing this
Mhm.
conviction, and I do hope that a higher court in Italy will recognize what the European Court of Human Rights has already recognized, that the result of those interrogations was not my fault because I was coerced and my human rights were violated.
Do you feel Patrick's human rights were violated as well?
Absolutely. He
Mm.
was arrested on the basis of zero evidence, and he was held despite the fact that numerous people came forward giving him an ironclad alibi. And he was held even after I retracted my statements. The very same day that I signed those statements, I retracted them.
Mm.
And the police continued to hold him for 2 weeks before they finally were forced to release him.
Mhm. You have a podcast coming out, a podcast series, as well as a new book that'll be released next year. Tell me a little bit about those two things.
Thank you so much for asking because this is something that is so close to my heart. First of all, the False Confession series that I'm going to be producing and putting out on my podcast, Labyrinths. It is all about what happens in the interrogation room behind closed doors, how police interrogation techniques are very effective at getting both guilty and innocent people alike to make implicating statements against themselves and others, and how we need to address the issues that cause wrongful convictions in the interrogation room. So I'm talking to experts, I'm talking to victims, and it is a very extensive and conclusive look at what I feel is one of the most astonishing and yet pervasive problems in wrongful convictions, which is police deception and police coercion. My book is going to be coming out next year, and I'm so grateful for the opportunity to put it out because it really answers the question of after you've gone through a horrific experience, now what? How do you rebuild your life? How do you make sense of what happened to you? And how do you find your place in the world and make meaning out of your misfortune so that it doesn't just feel like this great burden and this great, uh, you know, burden of grief that you continue to have for the rest of your life?
Mm.
How do you feel free and empowered even
Mhm.
despite what you went through?
It's been a terrible ordeal for Meredith Kercher's family as well. Would you like for them to listen to the podcast series? Would you like for them to read this book?
I would love for them to read this book and to listen to this documentary series. I don't know how open they are to hearing my voice, and I understand that because from the very get-go, they were given a false reality by the prosecution that implicated me and sort of put the blame onto me for what happened to her. And what I wish I had the opportunity to share with them is the shared grief that we have. Their worst experience of their life is also the worst experience of my life. We have that in common. And we also have in common the fact that we knew Meredith when she was a living, beautiful person. I was just getting to know her. And I wish that I had the opportunity to grieve her alongside them. So I wish that they would listen to my work and listen to what I have to say to give me a chance to recognize that we are on the same side after all.
I know you've said before that you'd love to have the opportunity to visit Meredith's grave with her family's permission, or if they would even accompany you.
Yeah.
How important is that to you? Tell me why.
So important. I feel like of the two of us, I was the lucky one. I mean, Meredith and I were both at very similar, beautiful stages of our lives, young, abroad, broadening our horizons, getting to know people, falling in love. And her life was cut short, and my freedom was taken away from me. And I feel like I'm a little bit carrying on her legacy as the one of the two of us who survived this experience. And I feel to this day the the privilege to live knowing that that privilege was stolen from her. And I want to honor that by visiting her and just having the opportunity to grieve. By the time that her funeral was happening, I was already in jail
Mm.
and I never had that opportunity. So I would love to be able to come face to face with what remains of this person who I carry with me to this day.
Mm. How did you manage to have any semblance of hope while being the outcast, while being the convicted murderer, while being the person that everybody thought they knew as somebody who was, I mean, they framed you in so many ways, especially in the media, particularly in the UK media with the Sun. I don't know what exactly was being said in the Italian media, but I read some of the articles that are still online on the Sun and the Daily Mail, and you were framed in a terribly negative light. How did you manage to maintain your hope in justice and your sense of self during that time?
Thank you for asking that question. For a long time, I felt like I was estranged from the rest of humanity, that even after I was released from a jail cell, I was not welcomed back into the world like a normal person. I was always going to be the girl accused of murder. And I struggled with feeling like my life had already been written for me and I could not establish relationships or a place in this world, a sense of purpose like a normal person. I did feel like I was bearing this scarlet letter. And I struggled with that for years. And it really wasn't until I met other wrongly convicted people, and I met them in the context of an Innocence Network conference where there were hundreds of other wrongly convicted people, that it really hit me that I was not unique. I was not special. I was a person who had gone through what is unfortunately an all too common experience, especially here in the United States. And even if I have been through what is an extraordinary experience for anyone out there in the world, the difficulties that I'm facing are actually universal. That struggle to to process grief and to like to accept that traumatic and unfair things happen to us, that is something that we all have to live with. And I think meeting other wrongly convicted people, having the opportunity to spend time with them and understand that even though we come from all different walks of life, We have this shared experience and this shared opportunity to grow from what is a deep, dark hole.
Mm.
Was very inspiring for me, and I continue to be inspired by other wrongfully convicted people to this day.
Something that I find interesting, that even in media articles that are quite neutral, there still seems to be built into it, as they update readers on your story, when they even mention that you're married now and you have 2 children, it's almost as if to say, remember that promiscuous wild girl? Well, she settled down now. It's written in
Yeah,
such a way that it should be a surprise that you have 2 kids now, that you're a mother now. So does it ever really leave you?
no,
Mm.
it doesn't. Because the first thing that people heard about me was that I was a drug-addled slut who participated in a death orgy.
Mm.
And I think that consciously or unconsciously, that stays with people. They are anchored to that bias. And I try to, I won't say not let it bother me, but because it is, and it is what it is, and there's nothing I can do about it. I instead of focusing on what I can't control though, I try to remember that what people think of me and how they were biased to think about me does not inhibit me from waking up every day and doing the very best I can.
Mm.
And looking at what I have in my life, what life has given me, and saying, what is the best possible thing that I can do with what I have? And it is bittersweet. It like it or not, I went from being an anonymous person to someone who has the opportunity to share my story. And not everyone who has been through my experience has that. So, really, I again try to find where I can be grateful and how I can make a difference in my own life and in others.
Do you forgive the investigators and prosecutors?
A lot of people ask me about forgiveness. And when I set out to process what happened to me, I didn't have forgiveness as a goal.
Mm.
What I really was haunted by was the question of why.
Mm.
Why did this happen to me? Why did they focus on me? Why did they make the decisions that they made? Why did they prosecute me based on no evidence when they already had the person who killed Meredith? Like, this isn't a case of we don't know who did it. We
Mm.
do. And I think the thing that I was really struck by is, in my case, and I think in a lot of wrongful conviction cases, it's not that there are these evil prosecutors or evil detectives who knowingly are putting in innocent people in prison. They are people who believe
Mm.
what they're doing is right. And I was fascinated when I looked into bias and and the kinds of ways that police are trained, that they are led to believe that their instincts and their intuitions are
Right.
correct even when they're wrong. And I think that that's a human error that I can understand. And
Mm.
because I can understand it, I don't that feeling of anger is tempered by a feeling of pity and a feeling of, "Oh my god, if I had made a mistake that big, how would I feel?" Like, I'm sort of compelled to feel compassion for those who
Mm.
did this to me, because whether or not they realize that it was such a huge mistake, I do.
Mm.
And I have compassion for that, which looks a lot like forgiveness.
It's interesting because from the accounts and the arguments from some of the prosecutors, to give one example, one of the prosecutors I remember saying, well, part of our case was that Amanda's blood was mixed in with Meredith's, or her DNA was mixed in with Meredith's blood, right? And so automatically you go, well, it's a fair assumption to make that this is something to look into, and maybe there are other reasons to explain scientifically why that's the case, but that sounds reasonable. On the other hand,
Right.
another prosecutor I remember explaining, and I'm sure you, and I hope this doesn't, I don't know, traumatize
No,
you
it's okay.
in
It's
hearing
okay.
this. He said, when we brought out the knives, and she put her hands on her ears, and I knew that meant that she was blocking out the noise of the stabbing, And I thought, well, how did you go from that to that, right? And
Yeah.
so for me, as an outsider, in hearing the prosecutors as well, sometimes I thought, well, I mean, that's something to look at. That seems like potential evidence that definitely warrants further investigation. And at other times, there were these gigantic leaps that come with all these presuppositions of you. Did you feel that sometimes they had a case and that credit where it's due, yeah, this needs to be answered for, and at other times they were just making things up?
Well, yes. To be frank, yes. I mean, so it's interesting because the in the way the case played out, they already arrested their suspects before they were able to really dig deep into the forensic evidence. They didn't have the DNA, they didn't have the fingerprints analyzed by the time they already had their arrested suspects. So, already by the time they were starting to analyze the actual forensics at the crime scene, they had uh, they had publicly made a very bold statement about how they had closed this case. And I think that that biased a lot of how they were approaching the forensics. They were saying, well, we've got our guilty parties. Now we have to prove that they are guilty. And so they would look at things like Amanda's DNA is in the bathroom mixed with Meredith's DNA. Well, I also lived in that house with Meredith. And so of course my DNA would be in the bathroom. But because they had already made that claim that I was guilty, she's arrested, here we go, decided to interpret the forensic evidence
Mm.
based upon that bias. But of course, now and then once they finally had the guilty party, they arrested Rudy Guede, this local burglar who had a history of breaking and entering. Suddenly they had to make sense of how he could be involved with me and my boyfriend who had no relationship with him. And so they just made up a relationship. They said, well, Amanda had a secret relationship with
Mm.
Rudy Guede and they were competing for Amanda's attention. And so the way they were competing was by raping Meredith for her. Like it was this whole obscene construction that was entirely the result of them logically trying to deduce based upon a false premise.
Right.
Their false premise of having arrested the guilty parties, and so therefore everything else must follow.
So as you mentioned, you and your boyfriend at the time, Raffaele Sollecito, you spent years in prison. You were then exonerated. Rudy Guede spent 13 years in prison for the murder of Meredith. He's now a free man. Tell me about how you felt when he was released.
I felt, and it was frustrating because the first headline that I saw was Amanda Knox's roommate's killer released from prison.
Mm. You're
So
always
once
in the headline.
I'm always in the headline. Meredith's name was not even in the headline.
Mm.
Rudy Guede's name was not in the headline, and it bothered me that I was I was the one who people associate with his crime. I'm the one bearing the infamy of his crime, and that bothered me. But furthermore, it bothered me that to this day, Rudy Guede has never been fully held accountable for his crimes. He was not ever, accused of wielding the weapon that ended Meredith's life. And I think that that is a great injustice to Meredith's family and to the truth in this case. And of course, we've seen it bear out that he is not a reformed person. He's since been arrested for assaulting another young woman
Mm.
who thankfully was not murdered. So I think that there's a lot to be said about how the Italian justice system failed in this case. And it failed in a big way by sidestepping and letting off the hook the actual person who committed this crime.
My very final question to you, I asked this to Anthony Graves as well, who was wrongfully convicted for murder he didn't commit. He spent 18 years on death row. I asked him, what does justice mean to him? I want to ask you, Amanda, what does justice mean to you?
Wow. Justice. I used to have such a uncomplicated feeling about that word. I think justice to me means that the truth matters,
Mm.
that we are all capable of making mistakes, but the truth does matter. And we are striving to acknowledge the truth and do what's right based upon the truth. And so I think that's what it means to me.
Amanda Knox, I thank you so much for joining us on the interview.
Thank you so much for inviting me.